Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So we'll resume looking at Section 106 costs briefly. So going back to question 3I, which says, are the allowances for Section 106 costs assumed in the residential appraisals justified by the evidence in tables 416 and 417 of the viability study, as updated by the topic paper and in comparison to the evidence of historic 106 costs in the council's response to my initial questions. I'm broadly satisfied that I've got sufficient information on Section 106 costs. I think Code, you've indicated that you've observed that infrastructure costs associated with the site you're promoting, HO13, are significant in comparison to historic Section 106 costs. And my thinking on that is, well, that suggests that a reasonable allowance has been made in that case. So in broad terms, I'm happy that I've got enough information to reach a conclusion on the allowances for 106 costs. It seems to me that the viability appraisals do include a range of allowances which are either in line with the historic costs or significantly above them, and that the withdrawal of the Newcastle Point local plan now means that affordable housing provision is likely to be lower than 40%. So in effect, increasing viability headroom to support CIL or other 106 costs. So I think that's where I'm at with 106. It seems to me I've got a fair amount of evidence on this now. I'm happy to take any comments on that, or if there's anything further you want to say. Don't know whether Council wants to say anything further, or Mr. Ryder or Mr. Tatton on this. No. Okay. Fine. Then we'll move on to benchmark land values. So this is question 3J in the main issues and questions. Question I asked was, are the benchmark land values assumed in the viability study for residential development on Greenfield and Brownfield sites justified by the available evidence, and in comparison to the benchmark land values established in CIL examinations in surrounding or nearby areas? So I think it would be useful to have up in front of you the initial viability study. So sub 01, and perhaps turning to the section on Greenfield and Brownfield values, which is paragraphs 483 through to 490, 4.90, 4.83 to 4.90. And then benchmark land values are then set out in table 419, so on page 46. Useful to have that up in front of you. And then the second document is to have the technical note that was supplied by the council in response to my initial question. So this is CPBC 1H, and there's a section in that which contains a table 1, which is a sample of comparator benchmark land values from other local viability assessments. Pages 8 to 10 of that document. We also just have those open in front of you. So a couple of questions for the council, but again, I'm happy for others to contribute to the discussion on these. I'm grateful for the council's response to my initial question on benchmark land values. But what it does indicate to me, anyway, looking at table 1 of the technical note, is that both the Greenfield and Brownfield benchmark land values assumed in the viability study seem to be considerably below those in the studies of surrounding areas in Essex. And if I can deal with Greenfield land first, so having read the VS, I understand the council's or PPE's logic in basing benchmark land values for Greenfield sites on a premium for the net developable land. I understand that with a standard agricultural land value for non-developable land. But the combination and that the premium for the net developable land at 375,000 per hectare, combined with 25,000 per hectare for non-developable land, when those two are put together, seems to me will result in an overall benchmark land value per gross hectare, which is considerably below the figures that I see in table 1 in the technical note. And I think that's what I'm trying to understand. So Castle Point's 375,000 per hectare, per net hectare, compares with land values of 480,000 in Brentwood, 524,000 in Chelmsford, and 380,000 in Thurrock, all per gross hectare or per hectare gross, all in the same part of Essex. And so I think what I'm struggling to understand how a figure of 375 per net hectare is an appropriate figure based on that available evidence. I wonder if the council could deal with that first, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm wondering whether Russ is here. I can't see his video, but I'll just answer part of your point first. I'd caution that the change in the PPG guidance, the methodology in terms of using the EUV plus. I've looked through a few of these studies, the benchmark land values, and it looks, the difference seems to be a kind of a difference in approach to how you come up with that kind of land value. So just for instance, Basildon is one that actually Russ and I did in 2015, I think. It's a 2018 study, but it was based on price paid data, which we found at the time in December 2015, and then subsequently indexed up. So it's a slightly different method, and I think that kind of explains the difference in the values. We have actually updated the Basildon study just at the start of this year, where we've moved to the new method, the EUV plus method. So
I didn't think the Basildon study was one that you'd included in that list. Sorry to.
Oh, sorry. I think Persimmon. I've got it in my notes. The Persimmon of cited. Yeah. In there. The other ones that Persimmon have looked at: Basildon, Chelmsford, Thurrock, and Braintree. I've looked at Chelmsford and Thurrock, and that's the same. That's based off price paid data. Braintree is is a study done by Three Dragons in 2017. It wasn't able to definitely tell the method they've used. They've used a few and then kind of come up with a value. So I can't really comment on that one. Certainly the three before a difference in kind of methodology.
But I was particularly focused on. I'm conscious that Persimmon had set out some benchmark land values which appeared to be per net hectare, I guess, to try and compare with the figure in the Castle Point study. But I was reverting to the evidence that he provided me in that technical note. So there were three studies there: one for Chelmsford, one for Brentwood, and one for Thurrock, all done by HDH Planning and Development. But they all come up with a gross figure for agricultural land or greenfield land per hectare, which is above the net figure for Castle Point. And I couldn't, if I'm honest, I couldn't really find in the evidence that you gave me there, I couldn't really find a comparator with Castle Point, and I wondered why a figure of 735 per net hectare was considered to be appropriate compared to what is obviously considered to be a reasonable figure in adjacent local authority areas. Yeah, Mr. Porter.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, as you can see in our response, we have prepared a table to identify the various land values, and in the ones that I think that are local to this area, and as in our response in paragraph 23, we do say that that the values that have been used in our report are generally for greenfield land assessments are higher than the Braintree Colchester tendering plans, and also it's, as I'm trying to find, it's lower than those assumed in Chelmsford, and also Brentwood and Thurrock. But it's difficult because those areas are slightly different places in terms of general market, and there's a vagueness sometimes about how land is valued, because in guidance it's quite clear. It says it has to be on its existing use value, and on top of that you need to add a premium in order to bring that site forward for the hassle factor.
Yeah.
And if you've got a greenfield site, its most productive use, generally you may get your paddock site, but it's going to be agricultural, good grade agricultural land, and we know that that's auctioning at around about £20,000 a hectare. So that's its real value as an existing use. And then you've got to decide on what hassle factor would bring that landowner to sell it to a housing developer. And because it's quite a low base, it's got a very high premium. And there is evidence that we presented in our work. In fact, we did quite an extensive discussion of this in our August 2021 study from I think goes earlier. It's about paragraph, from what I can see, it's a lengthy discussion from paragraph 466 to 491. So which explains exactly why we think that the appropriate premium is something close between 10 and 20 times, depending on specific sites. So we've taken the average of that, 15. And those premiums have been quoted through other research papers that the government's previously prepared and we've relied on. It's generally what we know developers may be going to ask a site owner to pay for his site, but they only pay that on the net developable area, the bit that actually has a development value, a development worth. Because, as we say in our note as well, it's kind of counterintuitive to sort of base it on the gross area, because if you're a site owner, and you want to secure a planning permission with less affordable housing, I'd put more land into it and value it at that development value of 385,000 for what's developable land. So why would you? It makes no sense. They would not pay that amount of hassle factor, 15 times more than that agricultural land is worth, if it's used as open space. There's no change in use. If it's used, okay, there may be some bits of it that increase because you've got a road now going through it, but on a per hectare basis, it's not worth much. So, and also that's drawn from our own experience of option agreements. So when developers are going to discuss the site they're going to buy, they look at the outturn of houses, how many units are going to get on that site, and the site is going to be built on. if the other land is required as part of that permission, that needs to be put into that mix by the landowner to help that bring forward. And at most, they'd only pay what is the existing use value for. There's no other development value for that land, which is why that approach of 375 and a net developable hectare is used. And if the site is much bigger, then you still get extra money on that per on a per hectare basis.
No, I do understand that, but you set that out. But when you compare that to what all other areas have used in their viability studies, I can't see one that is comparable to this. All the other figures that are quoted, so you quote Colchester, but Colchester is a figure of 240,000 to 480,000 per gross hectare. So they haven't indicated that, or your evidence doesn't indicate that that is only applied to the net developable land. That's a gross figure. But if you convert your 375 per net hectare into a gross figure, it would be significantly below 375 per gross hectare. So that's what I'm struggling. I understand the logic, and you know, that seems to me to be a logical approach. And I recognise clearly that, you know, if you present market evidence of land transaction prices, those don't necessarily indicate benchmark land values, but they're a useful check. So my view is you need to compare it with what's being done elsewhere in the local area, and it's the reason why I asked for that evidence. And the evidence you've given me suggests that the figure you've used is quite significantly, I mean, you haven't given me a gross figure actually to compare with this, but those figures seem to be significantly above a gross figure, you know, recalculation of yours into a gross figure. That's what I'm struggling to understand.
Yeah, I mean, if you, on a per hectare basis, we probably see that about 70%, 80% of that site is that developable.
Yeah. And
then, so you could times that and then add to that the extra £25,000 per hectare, whatever pro rata that is. So it's, and it kind of goes down to principle. I mean, we have mentioned other cases where it has been used, and pretty much it's how we use it now for all our examinations, which are, you know, we've been through and tested, and it's been agreed with. But I think also there was a case referenced in our own note as well in Trafford, which was more to do with a site-specific case, where the inspector went to town and assessing this premium, what the premiums had applied to, and his decision report had come back to say that he agreed that there needs to be a premium, but that premium should only be on the net developable land area, and he felt that the premium should only be no more than 10 times that. I mean, that's irrespective. It may be that area is not just the need for housing or whatever may not be as pushed there, but so that's another decision that kind of came through in the last sort of 18 months from the Trafford inquiry to say that it should only be applied to that. It's also been, again, we have put it in our note. I could probably make references to it in our report, which is because we do, as I say, we do extensively discuss this point. But there's also a viability toolkit for neighbourhood planning, which is produced by locality who are MHCLG, or whatever that is now, endorsed and supported organisation, and they note that it's in quoting their toolkit as well, quite clear. It says, be aware that land values are based on a gross basis, value of the whole site, and net basis, value of the net developable area. This is revenue generated by land. The value on a net basis will exclude areas of open space and the like required in the local plan. But therefore, this represents and it therefore represents the value of the net area. However, the landowners must be paid for the whole site. So we have taken the approach that we pay the site owner for all bits of land, but the only value, the outturn is 35 dwellings a hectare on developable area. And that's all. The developers get no more money. than selling 35 houses on that hectare, and so therefore they paid a premium for that bit of land. So it's more the principal approach. Now there are differences in approaches tested elsewhere. I haven't got all the other whole plan viability papers in front of me to forensically look at it, but I think we set it out quite clearly what we've done, and I completely stand by that's the right approach for a developer going to a site who's going to pay a site owner a value for that site.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with all that, and you set that out very clearly in your evidence. But I keep coming back to the point is when I compare that to gross values, for gross hectare benchmark land values applied in nearly all the surrounding local authorities in Essex, yours is an equivalent gross value is way below those considered to be reasonable in the rest of Essex, and that's what I'm finding difficult to understand. I'm presuming that a similar approach has been taken elsewhere in establishing a premium, but it's on that gross hectare figure that I can't see that your figure is appropriate. I understand the methodology, but the figure doesn't seem to match what is considered to be a reasonable benchmark in the surrounding area.
The other thing about some of these studies, I know the Chelmsford study was Jan 18, the Braintree Colchester and tendering was April 17, Brentwood 18, Havering June 17. They all predated the change in the way we assess benchmark land values, the EUV plus approach. So at that time, there was market information that you would be relied on to try and identify an appropriate benchmark land value, as we did in Basildon in our 2018 work ourselves. We looked at the evidence of purchase price for land, but both RICS and the RTP I've always promoted EUV plus since the Harman guide came out. RICS had sort of argued market price, and they've also now come around to accept the EUV plus as the appropriate method to assessing land value, which is what we've used. I'm not so sure these other studies had followed that same approach because it predates the change in guidance on viability, which is in PPG.
Well, I did ask you to provide some evidence. Yeah, I think you're saying that's not relevant evidence then. Is that what you're saying?
In these areas, our neighbouring areas, in terms of local evidence, these are the last studies. Well, when we did this at the time, so I'm not 100% sure that anything's changed since those, or they've been updated. Certainly, they've adopted CILs in some of these places, so not necessarily will have updated all the evidence.
Yeah, well, certainly the Brentwood plan has recently been examined, so there should be a relatively up-to-date study there. Okay. I'm going to ask Mr. Tatton or Mr. Ryder if you could just come in on this point. I think I understand you're mainly concerned with site HO13, but you're saying the benchmark land value should be 375 per gross hectare. Can you explain why that should be the case, or is that based on a price that's been paid, or?
No, it's not based on the price that's been paid, sir. It was in not being able to get under the skin of how the benchmark land value had been established. We just felt, and I think that's a comment shared with Persimmon's hearing statement, that valuation on the gross developable area is the appropriate methodology to apply in recognition that the landowner is deprived of their interest on a once and for all basis. The fact that part may equate to existing use value doesn't mean they can still use that land once it's passed to the developer. And in relation to HO13 and Mr. Porter's comments, I think he said it was typically 15 to 20%. In the case of HO13, that's 35% of the site area is undevelopable for residential purposes. So that's quite a significant amount. And for the record, on the gross site area, the benchmark land value in accordance with the council's methodology would be £252,000 per hectare.
Yeah.
Again, it's significantly below the comparables from the other studies.
That's a gross figure you're saying on HO13.
Yeah, if that's applied, yeah, the gross.
Yeah. Yeah.
The benchmark land value of 7.07 million.
Yeah.
I noted with interest Mr. Porter's comments regarding the Trafford appeal decision, which certainly raised a lot of eyebrows, but I think it's pertinent to note in that situation, the site in question was not allocated for development. I believe that whilst it wasn't greenbelt, it had a protected open space status, and that was fundamental in the inspector's decision making. Now, obviously, if we're talking about orderly planning and the release of sites, there has to be an incentive for a landowner to participate in the process and not seek to circumvent that by going with speculative applications that are in accordance with the plan. And also in that case, it is noted that the developer's option agreement or land purchase contract didn't have a minimum price, which is very unusual, I must admit. But again, it may have been instrumental in the inspector's consideration that benchmark land value would be based on the factor of 10 times existing use value. And finally, I think just in connection with the local plan viability study methodologies, whilst they haven't been reviewed, I think Mr. Porter is correct that the existing use value plus approach was to bring national guidance into line with Harman or aspects of Harman. And so it could be argued that all of those figures are based on a consideration of the existing use value and the appropriate premium required to incentivise release of those sites for development.
Well, I assume that's the case. Yeah. 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 Thank you, Mr. Tatton. Ms. Parrott.
I think I just need to add at this point that site HO13 was part of the withdrawn local plan and is not an allocation in the 1998 local plan and remains within the extent of the green belt within Castle Point.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, could I just ask Mr. Porter for your comment then on, so the appraisal for HO13, I understand that it's not in the 1998 local plan, but just as an example. So Mr. Tatton is right that the benchmark land value used for that appraisal is 252,500 per hectare. So that's the gross, I guess that's a gross per gross hectare benchmark land value. So it assumes that's what applying your methodology to a site of this sort of scale would mean in terms of a gross hectare benchmark land value, which, as I say, seems well below the others used in surrounding area.
So I think
I don't have a page number for you. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I can't actually see it, but it doesn't sound like that would be wrong. It would be something of that order when you look at the what you're establishing. But like I say, they're very large sites when you look at the gross area. The actual development takes place on a much smaller part of that site. And for that reason, the hassle factor for a landowner to transfer land that's green to a green use does not warrant a 15 times value on its existing use value.
Mm-hmm. Although if that land is required for the purposes of development, even if it's not being built on, but it's required to provide the necessary open space infrastructure or schools infrastructure, or whatever, it's necessary as part of the whole package, isn't it? So
yeah, there'll certainly be elements, but if you've got schools on site, that's to me net developable. That'd be included. So with densities, but generally, I mean, when we see this in terms of negotiations on site, based on our experience of the market, option agreements only work with them. Clearly, developers clearly stating that they are based on a net developable area, and generally the remaining gross area is transferred at no extra cost to the developer in order to secure that permission. And by that, we would say, okay, in some regards, that premium of 15 times reflects we need to get planning permission for this, and to get that, we need that area. It releases the net developable by adding the additional land. It releases that value on the net developable area and that's generally how it works in the marketplace.
But then you are pushing that gross the gross hectare value down to a figure that's well below what is being considered to be reasonable in surrounding areas. So I'm not convinced the figure you've used is a reasonable one. So the implication of that would be, what would be the impact of using a figure which is more in line with those used in surrounding areas? I think the gross hectare figure which is more in line with those. How would that impact?
The problem is that they're done on a different method. They'll be out of kilter with what's gone on with guidance, and also therefore if it's price paid for sites in, say, Braintree or elsewhere, they will reflect, because it's price paid, it reflects whatever their affordable housing rate is. It reflects what their local plan policy requirements are. So I'm not referring to price paid, Mr. Porter. I'm referring to the figures that you've given me in table 1 of your technical note. Yeah, as I say, they predate the existing use value approach, and so we can't rely necessarily on these figures being very accurate for that time.
Well, they all refer to existing use value.
Yeah, but
if you're saying that you've given me evidence which can't be used as a comparison, that wasn't very helpful, was it?
Well, if in some of them you go into more detail, they're based on existing use value, plus there's also got information that's got on price paid and other evidence as well that's sometimes helped to inform those prices. It may be a quicker review of some of these of reports than you asked for, but
I think what I'm going to need you to do, and probably the same for Brownfield benchmark land values, is to provide me with evidence of the sort of comparable benchmark land values that have been used in other studies elsewhere. I won't say necessarily in Essex, but elsewhere, let's say within the southeast, that follow the same methodology as yours and come up with comparable gross hectare values as 250,000 per gross hectare. I think that's what I need to see to be convinced that your methodology comes up with what is considered to be an appropriate figure in the marketplace.
Sure, sir. I mean, I know we've looked at it broadly around the country as well, and the way that benchmark land value is not consistent everywhere, and about half of them refer to net developable areas and half refer to gross areas, all different values as well. So there are different approaches. We set out our approach and rationale for our approach in our report, which I think needs to be assessed well. But I can't give you the forensic details on these other sites, other plans and what they're doing locally. But we'll go away and we'll pull something together and show you that evidence.
You are setting out an approach which is different to what I can see as being used elsewhere. Okay, so of course this is not the first time I've done a CIL examination, far from it. So I'm familiar with the approach that's used elsewhere. So there's a reason why it doesn't appear to me to fit with the sort of figures that I might expect to see. So if you can provide me the evidence that supports your approach, not just the methodology, I understand the methodology and where you've drawn that from, but I think if you can provide me with evidence that suggests that the figure you've come up with is a reasonable one, then I think we can move forward with it. But I need a bit more evidence to support what you've come up with.
Okay, noted, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask about Brownfield benchmark land values as well. So again, you have a figure of 800,000 to $1 million for Castle Point, and that compares with, if I just look at those three again, Chelmsford, Thurrock, and Brentwood, 1.32 million per gross hectare, 1.44 million per gross hectare in Brentwood. I wasn't clear whether your figure of 800 to $1 million per hectare is gross or net, so I couldn't establish that. I don't know whether you can just help me with that.
Yes, again, we follow the same approach we do for the Greenfield, in that the 1 million is on the net developable, and the existing use value for the remaining part of that site, which is Brownfield, is at £800,000. So it all depends on the ratio of gross to net, as you know that you're aware. So it's hard to give you an exact figure what that would be per hectare, because it will differ by site on a per hectare basis, depending on how much of it's developed. But it's obviously a lot more than the Greenfield because of its existing use value.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah. Yeah, and in terms of how that compares with what's been used elsewhere, again, what's your reasoning behind that? Same as the Greenfield, I take it.
Yeah, I think we try and bring in as much local evidence as possible rather than, I suppose, other methods. I mean, we fundamentally disagree with HDH and their approaches to lots of things, and possibly some of the others like BMP also. Well, for other reasons. But so we don't necessarily follow what they want to do. I think I follow really what I know the market do, having worked with developers, and also what guidance is setting us to do. So effectively, that's how we come to those figures. What we have used, though, is Brownfield site values. There's a lot more data in terms of industrial sites that that has been sold. Generally, we use for employment uses. So what we appreciate is that with those sites, the ones that would come forward for alternative use, i.e. housing particularly, is they are sites that they would gain permission because those sites are now obsolete for industrial use or employment use, etc. So hence we knock down the value of the asking price for those sites that are redeveloped for existing use, for dilapidation, and that's put into our base figure, and then there's still often a premium in seeking a change of use on brownfield sites, and generally you normally get around about 20% more. And again, there is evidence out there that's been reported by government in some of their own sponsored work that somewhere between sort of 10 and 20, maybe up to 30% more on brownfield sites would be a suitable premium.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand it. how you move from an EUV of 800,000 to a BLV of $1 million.
Yeah, so that's based on a 25% premium.
Yeah, but to get to your 800,000, you apply a 33% discount.
Yes, because it's yeah, just because at market rate, these aren't sites that are they're generally sites that are not in the right location. They're no longer fit for purpose, fit for modern market, so they won't come forward for employment uses. Hence, the government, the council, sorry, would be willing to consider them for alternative uses such as housing. If they were good employment sites, then you know, able to meet the employment price that's paid for these sorts of sites.
Yeah,
I don't think they're the ones that the planning department would allow a release of. In general sort of context, I'm not specific about policy on that, but that's generally the approach. So hence we knock those down slightly.
But if the market transaction figure is 1.25 million per hectare, so that's basically what someone could get for a piece of industrial land on the market. But the benchmark that they've got to compare that with for residential is 1 million per net hectare. I'm presuming 1.25 million is per gross hectare. Then even with the 25% premium, they'd be getting a lot less per gross hectare than they would if they sold it as industrial land. So I'm not sure where the incentive is for the landowner to sell in that case for residential. If the benchmark is set at,
because they would, because yeah, those sites are no longer sellable for employment uses because they are sites that don't come forward for employment uses anymore. Hence, they've gone for alternative use.
Yeah.
So it's either no value, they don't sell the site, they hold on to it. And you do see that in some sort of city centre sites in other locations. Yeah. The sites that are just remain vacant. No
so
value.
1.25. Sorry, just to understand, that 1.25 million per hectare then is not a realistic figure. Then that's not what they would get on the market if they sold it as a piece of employment land for employment purposes.
So the 1 point. So if they were to sell it for employment purposes, what we're saying is that they would get a figure of, I think, what's our starting figure on Brownfield benchmark land value, was the site in the value of the market, and take a third off because it's not a site that could be sold for employment uses. So the only way they would sell it on for employment uses or for somebody to develop it is if they knocked it down by about a third in its price. That's all it's be worth as a comparable to an alternative use, which gives them 25% extra.
Okay, sorry, I understand now. So the 1.25 million is what industrial land is being sold for on the open market at the moment, 1.25 million. But that's not what a dilapidated industrial site would attract if it's no longer suitable or attractive to the market for employment. Yeah, so the 1.25 million is purely a market transaction, is purely a comparable transaction. Yeah, and a starting point for you to reduce the effectively the value, the existing use value down to a reasonable level. So I understand that now. So yeah, so you take that as a starting point, you apply the 33% discount, that brings you down to 800,000 per hectare, and then you apply 25% premium to the developable area of that site. Yeah, yep. So that's right, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that's okay. Right. Yeah. So a landowner with a dilapidated site's got some value on it by taking it to housing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. I'll write to you on the issue around greenfield land values, just to explain what I'm looking for really. So okay, sorry, Mr. Tatton, you did have your hand up for a while. You've been very patient.
Thank you, sir. The conversation did move on quite significantly from when I first raised my hand, so much of what was said may have been addressed, but perhaps just by way of clarification from Mr. Porter regarding the £1.25 million industrial land value with regard to table 4.18 in the viability study. My understanding that is in effect industrial or commercial development land as in a cleared site, and that those values don't reflect the value of any sites with buildings already on them. Could we just obtain clarification on that point, please?
Yeah, Mr. Porter.
Yeah. So sorry, I can't answer that question. These are sites we've taken from the EGI that are being sold for for commercial uses.
Yeah.
So whether or not they got buildings or cleared, I don't know. I'm not sure if Mr. Tatton's had a look, so he might be able to answer for us.
But irrespective, Mr. Tatton, as far as I understand, these are market values for industrial land. But what the study, I presume, is saying is, in order to come up with an existing use value for a piece of industrial land that might be sold for residential, you can't take that market value as the starting point, because one assumes the land can't be sold for that, whether it's got buildings on or not, can't be sold for that. So you have to take a discount off of that of 33% to arrive at a figure of 800,000, and then apply the premium for residential on top of that. So that's my understanding. Yeah.
Yes, I think the thought process was that with it being a windfall driven local plan, that it was the existing brownfield sites which did come forward were more likely to contain structures on them, which does lead forward to the discussion about vacant building credit. But the description of those sites, in my mind, were sites within existing industrial areas rather than sites which are likely to come forward for redevelopment.
Yeah, but it provides a market value, doesn't it, per hectare for industrial land, from which you then apply the discount.
Yes, but I've just suggested that existing use values for sites with existing structures could be significantly higher.
Oh, okay. On what basis?
Because that is the development site value, whereas existing structures have got an investment value.
But only if they can be sold for that, though.
I suspect they could be a mix. They could be a mix of cleared existing structures. That's an average of a number of sites that local information that we could get at a time. We didn't consider it needed to be cleared or with industrial structure. It was just what these were transacting at in the market for industrial uses at that time, which set our starting base for existing use value.
Okay, well, I'm happy to leave it there for now.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making now, Mr. Tatton. That's fine.
I think we can go back in EGI and check for definite if that will help.
Yeah, not to worry, not to worry. I'll come back to you on that. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, don't worry. I'll respond on brownfield values as well. I just need a little bit of time to think about that. Okay. Just want to go on to sensitivity testing briefly, because I think I have enough information on this. But essentially, the question I asked is, has the effect of an increase in development costs and or reduction in sales values for residential development been adequately and appropriately tested in the viability study? In particular, does this take adequate account of the higher rates of inflation over the last 12 months and the associated increase in the cost of building materials? We did touch on this a little earlier, so possibly we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but I think, Mr. Porter, you set out earlier the work you've done just to review changes in house prices and building costs over the last 12 months. So you say, yeah, effectively the increase in house prices over the last 12 months in Castle Point of 13.3% effectively offsets the increase in build costs over the last 12 months of 9.1%. But you say the projected increase in house prices over the next 5 years is lower than, at 15.8% is lower than the RICS projected increase in the tender price over the next 5 years of 23.5%. But then you explain that because sales values represent a greater proportion of the overall, or build costs are about half of the sales values, so projected increases are unlikely to result in a lower return. So effectively, there's you know, the two continue to offset each other. So I understand that. And code, I think you've said in your work, your own appraisal work agrees effectively that the 21% increase in house prices in Castle Point over the last 2 years has effectively offset increases in construction costs. Your concern in particular, I think, is about the future, and your concern is that you don't think the council has adequately tested the sensitivity of an increase in build costs or reduction in house prices. I think what you're saying is that a 5% reduction in prices would produce a developer return which is reasonable at the margins, 17%, but a 10% drop would take it below what is a reasonable figure, about 12.8, 12.9%. So I understand those points. I understand probably the main concern, I think, is about the future and whether the viability appraisal has adequately tested, sensitivity tested those things. My summation of this is that the council has undertaken a sensitivity test for an increase in build costs and a fall in sales values, both separately and cumulatively. So that's there in the evidence. The council's also subsequently provided me with a sensitivity test for the impact of alternative affordable housing transfer values. Yeah, you both can confirm that over the last couple of years, those build costs, the increase in build costs and values effectively offset each other. I think probably my take on the future at the moment is pretty unknown, particularly in the circumstances we're in at the moment. I'm not sure there's any value to me anyway of further sensitivity testing around those things, other than potentially around benchmark land values, but we can come back to that if the evidence suggests that needs to be tested further. So that's the one thing I hold out on. I wasn't going to ask any more questions, but I'm happy to, for either the council or code resolve 106, just to come back to me on anything that I've gleaned from what you said. If I've misunderstood anything, please correct me. you're fine. Mr. Tatton, yes.
Yes, yes. I think we acknowledge that obviously the nature of the evidence provided for CIL examination is naturally rearward facing in terms of collated data. Obviously, the sensitivity testing to date, I'm quoting Mr. Porter's words here, the 5% increase in cost coupled with a 5% decrease in sales values is described as a worst case scenario. And I think in the current economic climate, that is very much an understatement. So it is uncertain as to how rigorous and severe that sensitivity testing should be. But nevertheless, I think it would be useful to, given the projections of build cost inflation, which are perhaps a bit more certain than the projections of house price deflation, I would really like to see a little bit more testing of the parameters. I did note there was some evidence provided from Savills, which suggests what you would have described as a very continuing rosy picture of the housing market, but not wanting to cast aspersions on the a professional property advisor's motivations. I don't think they ever have a contrary opinion on such matters.
Okay. I'm not suggesting the council needs to respond to that, but happy if you want to. No.
I think there's, other than to say, the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecast is not that dissimilar from Savills.
Okay. Thank you. I did ask a question about alternative evidence. What alternative evidence is available to support alternative assumptions for these inputs, and what difference would they make to the headroom for residential development support proposed CIL charges on the mainland and Canvey Island? I've noted, and I've had a look at the appraisal provided by Code. I mean, I'm happy I can read that alongside the appraisal provided by the council. I'm happy if you wanted to say anything more about that, Mr. Tatton or Mr. Ryder at this stage, but I wasn't proposing to interrogate you on your appraisal. But if there's anything you wanted to say in particular, I need to know. No. Okay. Okay, I want to come on to look at residential rates, please. So what I'm going to try and do is sort of 4 questions in here, questions 5 to 8, and I just want to take them in 2 pairs, really. Take questions 5 and effectively the 2 parts of that, and question 6 together, and then questions 7 and 8 together. Just try and deal with those in that way. So question 5 read, does the available evidence, including the viability study and the technical note on Canvey Island Brownfield sites, that's CPBC 03, it might be worth just drawing that out. Does that show whether or not residential development could viably support the proposed CIL charges for houses and flats of £250 per square metre and £90 per square metre respectively on the mainland, and £120 per square metre and £30 per square metre respectively on Canvey Island? And in particular, do the results of the appraisals for flats and houses on brownfield sites in Canvey Island show sufficient headroom to support the proposed CIL rates? What appraisal evidence is available to show the effect of vacant building credit and any reductions in the chargeable amounts of CIL due to existing buildings on the viability of brownfield sites? And they've asked a specific question about HO23, whether the rate, how the rate compares with the headroom for that site. And then question 6 is, do the results of the residential site typologies demonstrate sufficient buffers to absorb unforeseen variations in development costs and sales values? So just wanted to, grateful for the council just coming back to me in respect to vacant building credit and just providing some alternative appraisal work on that for me. If I can just find your, yeah. I'm just looking at tables 1, 2 and 3 of your hearing position statement. And just draw up Canvey Island. Yeah, Canvey Island brownfield sites. Note, that's CPB 03. Yeah, table 1 of that. So just looking at your, just coming back to the council, then a question for the council. Just looking at your tables 2 and 3 really of your hearing position statement. So my understanding is what you've done is you've tested the Canvey sites at the affordable housing rates in sub 01, that's 40% affordable housing after applying vacant building credit. That's in table 2, and then in table 3 you've done the same but for an affordable housing rate of around about 20%, but applying vacant building credit to that in table 3, and that the CIL rates or the headroom with buffers then is in the table below for brownfield sites, houses and flats. So that's helpful. So my understanding is that effectively shows that the effect of vacant building credit and a lower affordable housing requirement applied on brownfield flats and houses in Canvey Island produces headroom for CIL of between -36 pounds per square metre and plus 34 pounds per square metre. That's correct, isn't it? That's what I'm reading that correctly. Yeah. With the sort of maximum scope for CIL being 23 pounds per square metre with a 33% buffer, I think, on Canvey Island houses on brownfield sites. So I think that's my understanding as to what those tables are showing me in a nutshell. So I just leaving aside site HO23 for the moment. Just wanted the council just to comment on this. So if I look at those results and also the results in table 1 of the technical note, so that's brownfield sites on Canvey Island, and I also look at the viability results for brownfield sites on the mainland for 2 houses and 50 flats, I think is what I'm looking at. Yeah. if I look at those, it seems to me that the viability results don't support applying a CIL rate to brownfield residential typologies on Canvey Island. That's the conclusion that I draw from that. And I was interested in even applying vacant building credit and a lower affordable housing requirement, whilst it improves the viability results, it doesn't improve them to a point where they could viably support the CIL rates being proposed. It just seemed to me that the evidence doesn't lead to a conclusion that on Canvey Island, brownfield sites can support the proposed rates. Have I misunderstood that, or is there something else I need to understand here?
I think, yeah, from if you get into that level of detail on brownfield and greenfield values, then, or viability results rather, yeah. So these tables here are sort of presenting new evidence, really, because the way we set out to, I suppose, referring to guidance here is that not to set too many rates. You want to keep it fairly simple so developers know what they're paying when they buy land. Yeah. And we decided that the biggest difference in viability was the value differences between mainland and Canvey Island, and therefore set approach 2 different rates. And secondly, the biggest difference between building houses and flats. I suppose then thirdly to that, you could argue there's a difference in greenfield and brownfield for the just because of the additional costs on brownfield sites, and also their existing use values can always be higher than greenfield. So so on that, if there was another layer added, then that would be correct. Overall, if we're making sure that the bulk of development is not, and that's, I suppose, in guidance terms, that's the definition, as long as it doesn't undermine the bulk of development, so the majority of sites, then we wouldn't have a concern in setting a CIL rate for Canvey Island based on just the differentials for flats and houses, because we still know with those rates being applied as they are, the bulk of development would still come forward. But there will definitely be some sites that would not be able to afford CIL. Equally, there'll be some sites that be able to pay a hell of a lot more money in terms of planning gain for infrastructure funding. But we set a rate where we don't try to undermine that.
Yeah. Okay. No. I that's helpful that I've read the figures correctly, and I understand the point you're making. I think that the problem we have, though, is that, of course, brownfield land accounts for, I can't find the figure, on Canvey Island,
it's about 32%.
It's about 32% of all potential growth under the local plan. So it would seem to me that charging these CIL rates on brownfield sites is going to prevent 32% of the housing coming forward under the 1998 local plan. So if we take the figure of 1474, well, about 500 dwellings of that wouldn't be able to come forward on Canvey Island brownfield land. So it seems to me that's quite a significant impact. So yes, the majority of development could viably come forward. About 1,000 of that could viably come forward, but about 500 of that couldn't on this, which seems to me quite a significant impact.
Well, arguably, I mean, as always with this sort of fairly high level and on the side of caution, but we also apply a profit at the high level, 20%. And even if you allow for the CIL rate that's going to be asked for in order to meet their infrastructure requirement, because it's striking the balance between getting the infrastructure in to enable the housing to be delivered and being funded to make it so for these houses to be delivered, and the viability of those sites being passed on to the developers. If you broadly, I mean, what we see is if these sites would still come forward, but the profit rate would be getting closer to a lower figure towards the 15%. So but none of them, even once you allow a CIL in those, none of them would be a profit rate of less than 15%. So it's kind of in the range still that CLG guidance would suggest is appropriate for policy making, and that includes CIL. So yeah, there'll definitely be a squeeze on them.
I haven't seen the evidence for that. So if that's what you're saying, I mean, you'll understand, Mr. Porter, I'm simply working off the evidence that's presented to me, and my reading of the evidence that you've given me is that all of the evidence is pointing towards not applying CIL to brownfield sites on Canvey Island. But if you're telling me there's actually evidence that you're aware of or that could be put together which would suggest that actually that isn't the case, and that if you take a more flexible approach on developers' profit on brownfield sites, however reasonable that is, one would need to consider, but if you take a more flexible approach that those CIL rates could be supported, well, I haven't seen that evidence. Yeah, so it is about available evidence. That's one of the key elements of the examination that I undertake, and at the moment that evidence isn't in front of me. I hear what you say, but it's not in front of me. Yeah, Miss Parrott.
Would it be acceptable to provide you with that evidence?
That may be. Yeah, we'll perhaps come on to that. Okay. Can I just ask? I appreciate Code and Resolve 106 haven't particularly made comments on brownfield sites on Canvey Island, but yeah, Mr. Ryder, is there anything you want to say on this?
Thank you, sir. We did make comments on this within our most recent consultation statement, so for September 2022. So you'll be aware of the comments that were made there. It was really just a minor point to be made that in relation to the vacant building credit improved scenario that's been presented in the council's hearing statement, I would just note that a significant number of sites on Canvey Island are less than 10 dwellings in size, and so they wouldn't necessarily have to provide affordable housing in the first place. So I'm not sure that they benefit from vacant building credit relief. So it's just to highlight that even then they would still likely be struggling from a viability perspective. That was the only point that I wanted to add from myself. Mr. Tatton may have some additional points. I'm not sure, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So when you're saying a large proportion of those sites are less than 10, so you're referring to that table 1 list of sites. Yeah. Okay.
That's correct.
So if I looked at those, I'd see quite a large proportion of those are less than 10 dwellings on Canvey Island.
I think it's fair to say, sir, that the sites labelled as strategic sites, so the sites left over from the withdrawn plan that are within urban areas on Canvey Island, I think some of those are in excess of 10, but I think the majority of the Windfall, Schlar and BLR sites, are below 10. Not all, but the majority.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tatton, was there anything you want to say? You don't have your hand up, you don't have to.
Thank you, sir. My only observation is why set a particular rate of developer return as the threshold to be applied in the viability testing, and then when the results don't fit, say, well, we can disregard that and apply a different rate as long as it's in line with PPG. It seems rather disingenuous.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me just come on to, let me deal with questions 7 and 8. Again, if I can just take those together and perhaps come back to the question that you've asked me Ms. Parrott. So question 7 is the IDP addendum and the topic paper suggests the delivery of brownfield housing growth through the adopted 1998 local plan will rely on brownfield land, Shallart and Windfall sites. In the light of this and the answer to questions above, should differential rates be set for brownfield and greenfield sites on Canvey Island? If so, what should the rate for brownfield sites be? And you've already said your preference is not to do that, to keep it simple. And then question 8, overall, with the proposed rates for residential development in the mainland and on Canvey Island zones, put the delivery of planned housing development in the borough at risk. Yeah, and I think it's, if I can again sort of just summarise where I think I'm at with this, subject to any further work that the council might do. It does seem to me the topic paper confirms that brownfield sites on Canvey Island would account for about 1/3 of all growth. So one would have to say that's significant delivery, which would be at risk with these rates in respect of brownfield sites on Canvey Island. If I were to conclude that the marginal viability of brownfield typologies on Canvey Island, even when the benefits of vacant building credit and a reduced affordable housing requirement under policy H7 combined with the reliance of these sites, these types of sites to deliver housing development through the 1998 local plan, if I were to conclude that as a result of that evidence, that doesn't support the proposed CIL rates for brownfield land, I guess my question to the council would be, whilst it's not your preference, what would an alternative CIL rate for residential development on brownfield sites on Canvey Island look like? Would it be nil or a de minimis figure?
We believe it's important that all developments contribute towards infrastructure in the borough. There is a need for infrastructure of the order of £14,000 per new home, and the rate of £30 per square metre proposed would deliver just 13% of that in terms of the flats, so around £1,887 per new home. So clearly there's already sort of a significant gap between what's required and what would be delivered from those flatted schemes. We would therefore be of the view that a nominal CIL charge should be charged on Canvey Island in order to ensure that those homes are making at least a small contribution towards the infrastructure that is required, reflecting the viability considerations. If you were minded to go down that route, I would refer you to the technical note, the Canvey technical note, and within that, at paragraph 9, there are some proposed rates for greenfield sites, which we would advocate given the infrastructure funding gap that we have.
Sorry, paragraph 9, you say? Did you say paragraph 9 of the technical note?
Yeah, the technical note that deals with the Canvey Island brownfield sites. Yeah, CPBC 03. That's
greenfield though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's greenfield. So.
Yeah. So you would suggest putting the figures up for greenfield?
Yeah.
So I think it's just a sort of supportive evidence. Just in looking at the table in that note, table 1, obviously the brownfield, the Canvey Island sites have been set on all sites, be it housing or flats. But if you then drilled further down into the greenfield and brownfields within those as well, as we've done in that table 1, obviously the brownfield sites were skewing the average for Canvey Island which is why it's got a much lower rate than the mainland. But if you take the brownfield sites out, then there's certainly a substantial headroom within the greenfield sites to pay towards more infrastructure funding.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's highly unusual in CIL examinations for examiners to recommend that CIL rates be increased. I've certainly not done it before. So yeah, I'm not sure that that's a reasonable request. I read what you say, but my sense is if the council wants to go down that route, then an alternative would be to take this away and come back with an alternative set of rates. I think that and I'm not suggesting that. I'm just giving you my immediate reaction to that. But I think that's certainly the challenge that I would have in taking that particular proposal on board as part of this examination. Okay, just because I need to just take this away and come back to the council to be fair and just be clear how I think this can be taken forward. And I think that has been my ambition all the way along, is to try and move this forward to a reasonable conclusion, so that the council can plan the infrastructure requirements for sites that are going to come forward. You said a nominal rate for brownfield land. I think Ms. Parrott, and thank you for your response on that. I might just ask you to give some thought to that. So if I were to write to you and say, first of all, I'm interested in any evidence you can present to me which might demonstrate that brownfield sites on Canvey Island could support the proposed CIL rates if a lower than 20% developer profit were applied. I might be interested in seeing that evidence. Of course, that would be subject to consultation with the other parties, and I would be interested in the views back on that before reaching any conclusions. So I'd be interested in that, but if having looked at that and also the issue around benchmark land values, if having looked at that, the council's view is that there is an alternative nominal rate that could be made to work for brownfield sites on Canvey Island, then I think what I would do is invite the council to come forward with a figure to support that. I would try and find a way of wrapping that into a single further consultation after the hearing to see whether a figure could be arrived at which would be reasonable. But yeah, I think that's probably as much as I can say at this stage. In respect to residential rates, I think all along I've had some concerns about the brownfield rates, and I've tried to draw evidence from you to give me a better understanding of that. I understand where the council's at, but what I will commit to do is to write to you and just set out a way forward. It may not be next week, it may be the week after that I would do that. Okay, before we move on to retail rates and the general issues, which we'll do after a suitable break, is there anything more to be said on residential rates at all? Okay. Mr. Ryder, yeah.
Sorry, sir. I don't wish to prolong the discussion any longer than it needs to be. It's really just to remind you of our position that you've got in writing within our representations and then our hearing statement in relation to question 8 and the appropriate approach to take forward from here. I think the discussion this afternoon really reiterates our concern regarding the evidence base supporting the charging schedule at this time and the difficulty that we find ourselves in relation to the withdrawal of the local plan. And so I think it does point to our thought that this is a charging schedule that should be revised in line with the new local plan to be provided for the local planning authority, which would give an opportunity for it to be based on up-to-date evidence and would allow the council sufficient additional time to consider what appropriate rates for Canvey Island and the mainland may be. But as I say, so you have got that in writing. I just wanted to ensure that we'd had an opportunity to relay that to you this afternoon. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and just for the council, did you just want to come back on what I've just said on in terms of residential rates?
Just say that we'd be happy to receive your letter and guidance on a way forward.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to have an adjournment at this point, and then we'll come back at, well, let's say 3 o'clock, just to look at retail development. I've got a couple of questions for the council on that, and nothing really on general issues. So I'll probably need another half an hour or so with the council. I'm very happy, Mr. Ryder, Mr. Tatton, for you to come back after the break if you want to. I'm not proposing to say anything more about residential rates this afternoon. So yeah, the next sort of clarity you might get from me on that is in written form. So you're welcome to come back, but don't feel you need to stay for the remaining session. Miss Parrott, yeah.
May I just check you mean 4 o'clock?
What did I say? 3:30.
3 o'clock you said.
Oh, 3 o'clock. Oh dear me.
Yeah.
Getting ahead of myself. 4 o'clock. I did mean 4 o'clock. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ryder. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. It was just to say that you'll note that we haven't commented on the retail rates or the remaining questions this afternoon. So if you don't mind, sir, I think we may excuse ourselves at this point in time, but I may switch to the YouTube stream just so that I hear your closing for the hearing this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
thank
Mr.
you.
Clatton.
Just to reiterate Mr. Ryder's comments, thank you. And yes, we're withdrawing from the examination now.
Stage. Okay. All right. Thank you. So we'll adjourn at this point and come back at 4 o'clock. Yeah. Okay. See you shortly. just about on 4 o'clock. Fine, so we'll just deal as briefly as we can with retail development, please. So question 9 was the first of those in the MIQs. Question 9 read, is the CIL, well, it's in 2 parts, A and B. I'll ask A first. Is the CIL viability study appropriate for the appraisal of retail development in the borough with particular regard to the following inputs and assumptions? Firstly, rents and yields. So does the transactional evidence at Appendix C of the viability study support the rents and yields assumed in the appraisals for small local convenience stores, supermarkets and retail warehouses? So it might be useful just to have the Appendix C evidence on yields and rents available. Yeah, and I think also the relevant page of the the relevant page of the viability study in respect of I've now lost it. Yeah, I think it's page 49. There we are. The viability study. That's for the next one. Sorry, in respect of benchmark land values. So yeah, if we just have Appendix C open for a moment. So in relation to that question, the council, thank you for your response in your hearing position statements. You say the evidence shown in the CIL viability study for testing retail typologies in Castle Point reflects the available and proportional evidence at the time of the study. It was presented to and discussed at the developer workshop without disagreement being raised by the attendees, so that's helpful. Could you just help me on a couple of points? One is the figures for small local convenience retail development, so the rents and yields figures assumed, and also the figures for supermarket typology, the yield assumed for that, and the comparison with the market evidence. So yeah, if we look at Appendix C in relation to the appraisal of small local convenience retail development, in the appraisal, a rent of £195 per square metre and a yield of 6.3% has been used, compared to transactional evidence in Appendix C of transactions between, I think it's between 2016 and 2020 for general retail, and I'm reading that as the kind of relevant, probably the relevant figure. General retail of £172 per square metre as a rent, and a yield of just over 7%. So it seems to me the assumed rent and yield is much more optimistic, or a degree more optimistic than is evidenced in the transactional data. I just wondered if you could explain that. So £195 per square metre has been used against evidence of £172 per square metre for rent, and then a yield of 6.3% compared to one of 7.00%. So there seems to be a greater degree of optimism, and I wonder if you could explain how you derived that.
Apologies, old school error. So the rates that we've obtained from market information is generally, as you can understand, it's not like housing. It's not a huge number of new properties. So we've had to ascertain our rents and our yields based on well, two sources really. One is actual deals that have been done and reported on EGI, and they go back historically some way in order to have a sufficient sample in order to extrapolate from, or deduce from rather. But on that basis, that 100 average of 170, whatever you said, relative to 195 is going to reflect a premium for new build, because if you have a new build which is not in any way obsolete, it's going to be something that's built purposefully for the market, because often they come forward speculatively to meet that market. That rate would be a much higher rate than based on existing second-hand properties on the market. Generally, a lot of property, there's not been a huge amount of commercial development over a long time, to be honest with you. And so a lot of the properties that we do see in the marketplace now aren't quite fit for the modern retail market. Okay. Similarly, if you balance that with yield as well, so we will have evidence from mostly from new investment journals. So it'll be the journals of the likes of Savills that was mentioned earlier, Cushman and Wakefield, and any other property. I haven't got all the sources with me at the moment. What they're saying about secondary retail markets, we would consider this area to be almost a secondary sort of hotspot for retail, and what yields, so investment yields is performing. So this yield is a bit keener than what the current evidence got on deals, because for two reasons. One is it's partly informed by those market journals that talks more about the sentiment for investment against the bottom-up data, local data, which are properties that aren't so great. So they're generally going to get a higher yield on retail properties in Castle Point, because the rent relative to the actual value of that building in its current state, which would be fairly obsolete, is going to be a lot higher. So hence there's a squeeze down to say, look, we think if you've got something that's new, it's built purposefully for that market, it's going to fit the market better, so it's going to achieve higher rents than existing stock. And secondly, it's going to have a lower cost for maintenance and other things, so it's going to have a much lower yield value relative to second-hand properties.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Marshall, you want to comment?
Apologies, I may not have heard you in your opening sentence, but it was just a point of clarification. The local convenience, and we haven't made your life particularly easy because we haven't got table numbers on our appendix. Apologies, but
okay. For
our retail rents, it's in a table with the header "Local Convenience Retail Transactions between 2017 and 2019 nationally." I wasn't sure if that's what you read out to start off, though, but I just wanted to make sure you were kind of looking at the right one.
Looking at Appendix C.
Yeah, it is
and the first page of Appendix C, really. I'm looking at rents January 2016 to August 2020 and yields 2010 to 2020, and I was using the rate for general retail.
General retail would give us something in accordance with kind of high street retail. Those are the headers in EGI at least. Yeah. Food retail, if we're talking about local convenience,
where's the local convenience figure?
Isn't on there, and the reason for that is that this is to do the first two. You'll see the headers, one's Castle Point, one's Essex. There wasn't any data for local convenience in Castle Point or indeed Essex. So we haven't relied on those. For retail parks we have, but for convenience we haven't. There's a two tables further on.
Yeah, one's local convenience retail transactions 2017 to 19. Is that the one you mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are the smaller convenience retail, and there's a table after that which has larger properties on there, which is called supermarket transactions.
Yeah.
And purely for that, because they're national data, we've just kind of expanded our search a little bit.
Yeah. I think when I looked at that, I just couldn't see anything local to Castle Point, so it seemed to me. Yeah, I wasn't quite clear how much you can rely on those transactional those transactional, the data from those transactions to support the figure for Castle Point. Yeah, I couldn't really see anything that was close to Castle Point. So yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I couldn't see anything in there. I do see there's quite a wide range in terms of rental per square meter. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just comment on the nationals, sir. Sorry. So, unlike residential, where there is a bit of a bigger impact on I suppose the wealth of an area really, and its assets. Things like retail, particularly convenience retail, they tend to get invested in areas which have a similar catchment size. And doesn't, therefore, if it's a supermarket, for instance, they may, like an Aldi would say, we need to be in a sort of in the sort of central position of about 30,000 people that will come and spend in our store. Yeah. And generally, the average spend across the nation on groceries isn't that great by area. So you could almost use national data to give you at least where you haven't got local data. I think national evidence on those sort of sectors is likely to be similar across most areas, subject to being located in the right location. So if it's a supermarket, they tend to pay a lot more money for land in the right location because it's got access to 30,000 people, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as it's not quite as sample rich as residential.
I understand that. That's fine. You've explained that to me to my satisfaction, so that's good. Can I just ask the same question on the supermarket typology? So it's just the yield, really. You've used a comparable. If I go back to that table at the top, where am I? Yeah. So you've used the yield of a rent at £170 per square metre, which is comparable to the figure for general retail, but a yield of 5.8 compared to 707. So again, what was the justification for the much more positive yield? Yeah, Mr. Marshall.
It's actually 5.75 and 6.25. I think there's a rounding issue. I think what we've done is we've looked at what the yields are nationally, which I think was 6%. And I think we looked at, we know from other studies we've done that the local convenience tends to have a kind of a softer yield than the larger supermarket. So I think we've varied around that 6%. So one's gone 25%, 0.25% higher, and one's gone. We have actually got I just want to point out, we have actually got a food supermarket yield for Essex, not in Castle Point. So it's in the two tables I told you not to look at earlier, but I'm going to go back on myself a little bit. But just to say that there's 4 yields in Essex that kind of average to 4.92%. I think.
Where are they?
Sorry. So it's in the second table. We've chose, as Russ said earlier, we've chose to use the national data just because we've got such a larger sample for that. But I just wanted to point out that that's I think I
just can't see where you're referring me to. Can't see a yield. I can only see.
It's the second table down on that page, and there's not a yield for Castle Point, but there is a yield for Essex. So it's the final 2 columns, and it's in the retail section. It's the second row down in the retail section.
I just couldn't see that's for Essex. It just says Castle Point and Essex.
So the first 2, unfortunately there's no lines, but the first 2 columns are the count and the yield for Castle Point. The second 2 columns are the count and the yield for Essex as a whole.
Yeah, okay. It's staring me in the face. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to look at benchmark land values. So we'll go to page 49 of the viability study. Yeah, sorry, page 50 of the viability study. There's a table there, table 4.24. So the question I asked is, what is the appropriate available evidence of existing use values and landowner premiums to support the benchmark land values used for the appraisal of non-residential development typologies in table 4.24 of the viability study. So in reply to that, in your hearing position statement, I think you've reiterated what you said in the viability study, and I've perhaps not made myself clear enough on this one. So yeah, I can see that you've used websites such as EGI and local land agents, confidential appraisal, so on and so forth, but I just couldn't see the transactional evidence there, and that's really what I was looking for. So there's nothing in terms of transactional evidence or comparison data in the viability study to give me any sort of benchmark to compare those figures with. They're just a set of figures which I have to trust you is drawn from reliable sources, but I can't see that. So in terms of the job I've got to do, I can't really test that unless I go finding my own data, which is not really the purpose of my role. So is there any data that you can supply that supports those BLVs? And I guess I'm mainly interested in the ones for retail, because those are the ones which are looking to charge a CIL rate. Is that available?
Yeah. So yeah, we'll send you a list of information in regards to transactions related to those types of uses and what they're achieving.
Yeah.
And also some of it is, I mean, some of it is we've got good information like industrial warehousing. We have some the deals, and actually that's what helped inform our earlier benchmark land values for housing. And then some of them like supermarkets, etc. There is a bit less information out there. It's a bit like what we do know is that we've had some in the past, which is price paid for land, and supermarkets are probably paying close to about 3 million sometimes for the right site, but that doesn't fit the new approach of existing use.
Yeah.
So all these sorts of sites could effectively be either on existing sort of industrial type locations, or like retail warehousing could happen on those sorts of sites. There may be some for sort of city centre or town centre for hotels. There are some transactions for hotels as well. We can bring that out and show you that as well.
Okay.
But it may not be in Castle Point necessarily, but it will just be generally what they're willing to pay.
Yeah, I guess it's just the data that you base those assumptions on. That's really what I'm after. So I can say, okay, yeah, I can see where you've drawn that evidence from. Yeah,
sure.
So you've referred to the website, so I take it on trust that you've looked at those. But again, just for me to be able to test that as available evidence, it would be helpful if that could be submitted. So, okay, thank you. Okay. So question 10 then is on retail rates, and it's coming back to this particular question around the 200 per square metre rate and applying that at to floor space up to 800 square metres, and trying to understand how you've arrived at that threshold from the viability assessments that you've undertaken. So the question is, number 10 is, in the light of the council's answer to my initial questions, does the evidence of viability for small local convenience store development of 280 square metres to support a CIL payment of £200 per square metre, does that justify that level of CIL charge for convenience retail floor space of up to 800 square metres? And I think it's that I'm just trying to get an understanding of. So you've helpfully provided evidence previously. I think you've not sought to add to that in your hearing position statement. I won't sort of summarise that, but I think based on the evidence that you provided, it just seems to me odd to set a threshold for a higher retail CIL floor space, a CIL rate of £200 per square metre at 800 square metres, when the viability study only tests viability at 280 and 1500. So it's almost a figure right in the middle, and it's just trying to understand the logic of how you've demonstrated that floor space up to that level can viably support that figure. And the appraisals you've presented to me don't provide that. So I think I'd normally expect to see an appraisal test viability just above or just below that threshold to establish sort of where the cutoff point is. And I think particularly given the significant differential between the first 800 square metres, the charge for the first 800 square metres, and the charge above that. So yeah, just for me to be able to test that that's an appropriate threshold, I need to understand how you've arrived at that figure from the test that you've the appraisals you've undertaken. If you could help me with that, please. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we can present with a 800 square metre floor space size. Generally, what we're trying to do is we're sort of using a sort of average size for the small local convenience, and that could be anything from a little spa shop, Londis type convenience retail, up to something closer to a metro store, which you may find like a small Marks and Spencer's or a small little Tesco. Some of them on retail petrol parks. And then you kind of get to the next level of supermarkets, which would be the Lidl and Aldi, which is where the most investment's coming from now. And they generally look for space of between 800 square metres up to about 1,500 square metres.
Yeah.
And then when you get beyond the 1,500, or we're actually up to 2,500 normally, that's when we're calling the sort of bigger supermarkets. It's kind of, we use that figure just because that local convenience, we probably could have used a couple of typologies maybe to help, so we can show what a slightly bigger one would be like if we test it. It's close to 800, if that'd help.
I mean, I suppose I'm not understand that you're applying your market knowledge to where the sort of the size of space that not normally the sort of discount operators will tend to go for. I suppose when I read so I asked the question. Obviously, it's the reason why I asked the question in my initial questions, and in response to that, you gave me an answer which part of which said local stores tend to occupy space ranging between 200 square metres and 400 square metres, but could also reach up to around 800 square metres before being considered a traditional supermarket store, although development of convenience stores between 400 and 800 square metres is rare. So, I think it seems to me that if between 400 and 800 is rare, why set the threshold at 800? Why not set it at 400? That might be seen to be closer to the the size of store at which you've carried out an appraisal. Yeah. So I think that's whether an appraisal of an 800 square metre store would help. I'm quite happy to look at that. But yeah, if convenience stores are between 400 and 800 are rare, then it would seem unreasonable to set a higher rate up to 800. Yeah.
Yeah, well, only in the sense of if you're seeing anything less than 800, it's not likely to be an Aldi, it's not likely to be a Lidl, it's not likely to be a Tesco supermarket sort of thing. It's generally going to be a Metro store, like, you know, a small Tesco Metro on a street corner, or but they generally build at 250 square meters, so for 300 or 400 square meters. They're not normally that big. It's almost, but so you could set it at 4. It doesn't really make too much difference, I suppose, if you set it at 400 or 800, because you, like I say, you're not really going to get that development happening. No one's going to lose out really by setting that, because it just doesn't generally happen. But I suppose it's just a cut-off for.
Yeah, and
we know.
And it's the rate following the evidence, really, and I couldn't see that in this case. You know, the evidence seems to suggest, yep, it's viable at 280. You could potentially stretch that to 300 or 350, but not at 800. So yeah, it was that gap in information that I wanted to understand. So yeah, I'm not too sure whether the easiest thing to do is, if it makes little difference, is just to set the rate lower to lower threshold, so that the £50 square metre applies from, you know, 400 upwards or whatever, or whether you can provide evidence of kind of typical convenience local convenience stores who are around that 800 figure and provide an appraisal of that. Yeah, Miss Parrott, sorry, you had your hand up.
We do have a range of mini supermarkets in the borough, so we could potentially look at the floor, look at the sizes of those, and potentially that will provide us with a guide as to where that threshold should be set. So we could do that piece of work.
Yeah. Okay. Is that all right, Mr. Porter? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good approach. Yeah, just have a look at some local sizes.
Okay, thank you. And then finally on retail, is this question 11 on retail rates. Do the proposed retail development charges allow sufficient buffers to absorb variations in rents, yields and development costs, including Section 106 costs? If so, what is the available evidence to support that conclusion? Yeah, so in response, you said table 5.5 in the VS, and just get there, page 57. Shows that there's a minimum of 33% buffer, for all the retail CIL rates, and further there's a 4% contingency built into the viability modelling to cover potential unknown cost overruns. So you're saying but essentially the rate is not set as a margin of viability for the bulk of non-residential retail developments that will come forward. And and that's fine and fair. I hear that. I understand that. I guess my concern is that the VS doesn't do any sensitivity testing for sort of variations in rents and yields and development costs for retail development, and also so the appraisals don't allow for any Section 106 costs because they're hard to identify, but retail development does sometimes or would reasonably be expected to contribute to infrastructure costs at times. So yeah, it's just, I guess it's just how the VS accounts for those things. So if there is a Section 106 cost, how is that accounted for in the margins, really? Yeah. Sorry, you're muted, Mr. Porter. Glad it's not just me.
Yeah, I appreciate your request for sensitivity testing. I think the 106 is always difficult with non-residential. You do get some on some of the very much the bigger supermarkets and maybe the retail warehousing stores. Let's say possibly on the smaller stuff that comes forward. But I suppose the testing is a little bit less stringent. As you probably see in most sales examinations on a non-resi, partly because the scale of the development, it doesn't really make, it's not much that's expected to come forward in most locations. And so most time is spent on making sure that you get robust evidence for the resi where the bulk of floor space will be covered. Yeah. So, but even so, I suppose you could sensitivity test what the impact of, say, the changing build cost on some of these would be. But the problem I always find, and this is probably my own opinion rather than anything guidance, but the issue with sensitivity testing is kind of you still have to set a rate somewhere. Yeah. And sensitivity testing, things could become better or become worse. Yeah. You still supposed to aim in the central point, so it's because otherwise you're undermining the council's ability to pay for its infrastructure by just looking at the worst case sensitivity tests. Yeah. So I'm not sure it always gives us a huge amount of value in terms of setting CIL rates, but I can understand you haven't seen it for this. I can be guided by you if you'd like us to run it.
Well, I guess I'm just what I'm trying to get a feel for is just the quantum of margin that, let's say, a 33% buffer and a 4% contingency actually provide for in terms of potential variations in cost. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at is what is the, it may be there in the appraisal and I've just not picked it up. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So
yeah, supermarket. Try to look at supermarket. Yeah, so on a supermarket build, a contingency is about 115,000. I think the buffer is about £19, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So the buffer's not an enormous amount anyway. Yeah.
We've got about 33. Well, it's more than 33% the buffer. Yeah. Of the headroom. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. No, I understand what you say about sensitivity testing on retail. That yeah, there's less there's less schemes and therefore less likelihood of variation in those types of schemes. So leave that one with me. At the moment, I don't think there's any great value in sort of further testing that. So I'll just take a further look at those figures. So. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Miss Parrott.
Just to come in on the section 106 for those types of development. Historically, we've had an Aldi, a Lidl and a mini Sainsbury's all built, and they've just had to do some section 278 works in terms of their access onto the highways. They haven't been required to make section 106 contributions, principally because they haven't achieved the thresholds in terms of size for childcare provision or for employment and skills contributions as set out in the county's developer contributions guidance. On occasions, they do have to make some on-site provision for drainage capacity in terms of swales and so forth, but that's obviously on-site kind of activity. Within the infrastructure funding statement, which I think I provided to you as part of the initial questions, the most recent one, you'll see that there's only one non-resi scheme on there. That's a scheme to the south of Northwick Road. It's about a 7-hectare site, and the contributions that they had to, it was all industrial. They've had to make some childcare contributions and some highway access arrangements and some on-site drainage provision. So that's the kind of section 106 that's typically been secured historically on those sort of industrial and non-residential sites.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just very briefly on instalments policy and discretionary relief. So on instalments policy, just to make absolutely clear, the question I've asked here is, does the evidence demonstrate whether the proposed instalments policy would assist or threaten development viability and hence the delivery of development across the borough? So to be clear, the PPG regards the existence of an instalments policy as a material consideration in assessing viability, and whilst the wording of the policy isn't before me, or indeed the number or amount or timing of payments, it's relevant to understand how the draft policy would help the viability of sites and the viability of the types of development that are being tested. So it's the reason really for asking the question, but I'm happy with that the council's given me a response to the question, and yeah, I don't have any further questions to ask on that. So again, that's just to put that in context. And then discretionary relief. Does the evidence support the need for a discretionary relief policy from the commencement of a CIL in Castle Point, and with the absence of such policy put at risk the overall development of the district? So again, thank the council for their response on that. Yeah, I think I'm satisfied. I don't have any further questions on that. I've got enough information on discretionary relief. So okay, again, that's a matter for the council, but yeah, it's whether a policy like that would assist where you know, there are circumstances of marginal viability. So okay, unless there are any other points on the general issues, I will just kind of sum up from today and just confirm, I think, at the the bits of further work that need to be done. So I think the first thing to say is to thank the council and council's team for your help today in answering my questions. I appreciate I've drilled down a fair bit, but it's to try and just get to the bottom of the evidence. Also grateful to the representatives of this land for their attendance today. So from all of this, I think there are a number of pieces of further evidence that are needed for me to reach a conclusion on whether CIL rates are compliant and viable. The first is around infrastructure funding. So a bit of work we discussed, the infrastructure funding gap, the bit of work we discussed this morning. So some work to understand the infrastructure funding gap based on the revised actual number of dwellings which may be consented under the 1998 local plan. So I think that's the first thing, is just to understand more accurately the funding gap. Secondly, some evidence to support the benchmark land values which have been assumed in the report for residential development. Thirdly, the impact of any adjustment in developers' profit on the viability of brownfield sites in Canvey Island, certainly something that we talked about earlier. And then fourthly, in relation to the same issue, whether a nominal rate for brownfield sites on in Canvey Island would be justified. So I think that's we did discuss that, whether a nominal rate could be justified to provide some support for infrastructure, and then lastly, some evidence around the sort of transactional evidence to support benchmark land values for retail development. So just some evidence around that. I don't think there was anything. Oh yeah, no, beg your pardon. And then lastly, just some information. You're going to look at the range of convenience stores to establish the sort of typical floor space range of local convenience stores, and to test at the threshold of whatever the typical range is. So I think that was probably the last piece of work we talked about. So unless there's anything else that I've missed there, what I'll do is write to the council with my comments and my views on this and set out next steps following the close of the hearing. It is likely to be a couple of weeks. I appreciate that you were time constrained and keen to resolve the CIL examination before the end of the year, but it's likely to be a couple of weeks before I can get that letter to you. But that will certainly set out more clearly the additional work I think is necessary and how we move things forward. Is there any further comments from the council at this stage?
No, I don't think so. I'd just like to thank you for your time today, even looking at our proposals. That's
okay. Pleasure. Anything more from? Sorry, Russ, Mr. Porter, you want to say?
Sorry, no, nothing other than say thank you for your questioning today and
okay.
Working through this was.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, was there anything on the procedural side that I've missed? No.
No.
Anything you need to say to the council here?
No, nothing at all. Nothing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, well, in that case, the hearing is now closed, and as I say, we'll write to the council. Hopefully, in about 2 weeks' time, you should receive something. So, thank you again. Hearing is closed.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,